There's still a ton to take care of here in the 2024 season. College football playoff runs and bowl games to finish off the seasons for a lot of Big Ten teams, but we're already looking forward to 2025. The Big Ten Conference is looking forward to 2025 as they release the complete 2025 schedules with dates and orders and bye weeks of games. Let's break down everything 2025 schedules, who's got the toughest roads, who's got the easier roads, and everything in between as we go around this big old nation.
From Pasadena to Piscataway, College Park to the Coliseum, Seattle to State College, Columbus to Camp Randall, the Zoo to the Rock, and everywhere in between. This is where Big Ten fans gather to talk America's premier national conference with your host, Big Ten Ted. All Big Ten, all year long. This is Big Nation.
Here at Big Ten Ted headquarters in the state of Minnesota, it is in the single digits. We got to go through an entire winter. We got to go through a spring. We got to go through a summer before we get to 2025. So there's a long way to go. We've got 2 portal periods to go. The teams that I'm going to be talking about and some of their schedules here, they're going to look a lot different. So let's just get that out of the way. We're certainly not throwing out any predictions right now, but you can sort of see which teams might face a little bit of bumps in the road, which teams have a little bit of an easier slate compared to 2024. Let's dive right into it with the complete grid, with the complete schedule. There it is, folks, in all of its glory. And I want to take away some broad takeaways from this schedule right away. And I think it's very clear that the Big Ten Conference is going to keep the West Coast teams together against each other late in the season. I know some teams here from the North have wanted to see USC or UCLA. Hey, let's bring them to Minnesota. Let's bring them to Wisconsin. Let's have them in this type of weather late in the season. I just don't think that's going to happen. Like, you look at week 13, USC traveling to Oregon, Washington at UCLA, and then, of course, rivalry week in week 14th when you have the Oregon Ducks going to Seattle to take on Washington, UCLA at USC. And that is the only time when the West Coast teams play each other in the 2025 season as well. Big non-conference games. Maybe there aren't as many as there were this year, and I think and this has been talked about nationally, maybe you won't see as many big non-conference games, but the ones that certainly stick out, week 1 when Texas travels to Ohio State, and week 2 when Michigan goes to Oklahoma. Speaking of week 2, how about Clay Helton coming back to the Coliseum? He's going to shake hands with Lincoln Riley at some point, so that's going to be a lot of fun. Of course, Clay Helton, the current head coach at Georgia Southern. Now, we had that stretch last year where Oregon played 8 I say last year, right? We're like it's already the season's over. But in this season, in 2024, Oregon played 8 straight Big Ten games. Now, Illinois and Purdue are the only Big Ten teams that come close to that. The Illini and the Boilermakers both have stretches where they play 7 consecutive games. Illinois plays 7 straight to start the season. Now, that includes 4 Big Ten games. Of course, the 3 non-conference games right off the bat for Illinois. But you look at Purdue in the middle of the season, they go to Notre Dame. They have a bye, and then 7 consecutive Big Ten games before the bye, and then Indiana. That's kind of what Oregon had because they had the bye week before rivalry week. So Purdue kind of getting that treatment in there as well. Some big Big Ten games that I've got my eye on. Week 5, of course, Oregon at Penn State. I would love to see this as a whiteout, but as we know, no guarantees with Big Noon and Fox paying the most money in the Big Ten television deal. How about Indiana traveling to Autzen to take on the Oregon Ducks in week number 7. Now, Indiana, you look at their schedule, there's a chance that they could be undefeated. Their non-conference is very easy again this year. Home against Illinois, at Iowa. They have a bye, and then they travel to Oregon. Oregon will also have a bye before they play the Indiana Hoosiers, of course, week 10. Penn State traveling to Ohio State. I think that's in that early November slot, just like it was this year as well. If there's an early week to kind of keep an eye on, I've got week 5. Oregon at Penn State. We already mentioned that. How about Ohio State? They got that early game against Texas. The Buckeyes going on the road to the Pacific Northwest to take on the Washington Huskies. The Buckeyes will be coming off of a bye that week. Indiana at Iowa. That should be fairly competitive. Indiana and Iowa could be both sitting pretty good early in the season at that point in time. And then USC traveling to Champaign to take on the Illinois Fighting Illini. That's a pretty good slate of games, certainly in there as well. Now, I thought the Big Ten did a pretty good job. There's a few quirks in the schedule, which we'll get into a little bit later on, but they did a really good job in terms of travel, where you have a bye before you go on the road, or you have a home game right after some of these cross-country trips. Now, what do you say we start talking about some individual team schedules that certainly have my eye? We can't start about talking about schedules unless we talk about the defending champs, right? How about the Oregon Ducks 2025 slate? Let's chat about it. How about you're going to kick things off with the number 1 overall seed in the current FCS playoffs in the Bobcats of Montana State over there. You know, I kind of look up and down this schedule for Oregon. Of course, we mentioned that game against Penn State. That's going to be talked a lot about this offseason. That's going to be talked a lot. A Big Ten championship rematch, certainly over there in State College. And then you look at that game against Indiana. But there's a lot of winnable games on this schedule for the Oregon Ducks. If we know anything about Oregon, we hear them get visits from Dylan Thieneman and Bear Alexander, and possibly in the mix for a guy like Deuce Robinson. Like, they're going to backfill some of these roles. Oregon is, and Dan Lanning is as good as it gets with teams in the transfer portal at addressing certain needs, and just the way that they've been able to recruit over the past few years since Dan Lanning has been the head coach. You know, the Ducks are certainly going to be in the conversation, and with no Michigan on the schedule, with no Ohio State on the schedule, this, when you kind of look at it up and down as we stand right now, seems like a pretty good situation for Dante Moore to be able to step in for the Ducks and have success certainly right away. Now, I want to talk about a team that was 7-5 this season, that when I take a peek at their schedule, this is a team that I think could be at the very least a fringe college football playoff team, and that is the Michigan Wolverines. What have we seen from them this offseason? They are willing to spend the money to go out and get players, and if they can form a respectable roster around Bryce Underwood this season, this is a Michigan schedule that is very advantageous to get them back onto the right track and in the mix of the CFP when all is said and done. They don't play the defending champions in the Oregon Ducks. They don't play the defending Big Ten runner-ups in the Penn State Nittany Lions. They don't play the Indiana Hoosiers, the only CFP team from this year that they don't play next year. Of course, the Ohio State Buckeyes at home at the end of the season. They play every Big Ten team that didn't make a bowl game. Home against Wisconsin, home against Purdue, at Northwestern, at Maryland, and the rivalry game for the Paul Bunyan Trophy at Michigan State. They play 7 teams on their schedule that failed to make a bowl game. You include home game against New Mexico, home game against Central Michigan. I kind of look at those non-conference games. Of course, you got that game on the road against an Oklahoma team, but that could be a pretty good 3-game stretch if it is indeed Bryce Underwood to start the season for Michigan, where he could certainly get his feet under him and build a lot of confidence before they step in to Big Ten play. Now, here's also something to keep in mind. I mentioned those teams, those 7 teams that did not make a bowl game. And then they play 4 teams that finished 6-6 in the regular season this year. At Oklahoma, at Nebraska, at USC, and home against the Washington Huskies. The only team on this Michigan schedule for next season that had 7 or more wins this year were the 10-2 Ohio State Buckeyes. I know there can be a lot of fluctuation from year to year, but if I'm a Michigan Wolverine fan, I am loving this schedule certainly right now to be able to take a step in the right direction and to get back into that college football playoff discussion. Now, that was the optimistic side of the schedule, and maybe the pessimistic side. Wisconsin, it is going to be tough. I saw someone tweet on Twitter, hey, I think we're going to be asking ourselves here, maybe pretty soon, what was your favorite moment of the Luke Fickell era? Because when you look at where Wisconsin is as a program, how the fan base is feeling, And then you look at this schedule, it is not looking pretty for the future right now of Badger football. Rutgers, I think, is a pretty hard schedule as well, but when you factor in the non-conference game against Alabama, I think Wisconsin has the toughest schedule in the Big Ten. Now, you start off good with home games against Miami of Ohio and Middle Tennessee in Madison at Camp Randall Stadium. But check out this next stretch for the Badgers. At Alabama, home against Maryland, you thankfully get a bye, and then check out this 4-game stretch. On the road at Michigan, home against Iowa for the Heartland Trophy, home against Ohio State, and then on the road in Eugene to take on the Oregon Ducks. Like, that 4-game stretch is absolutely brutal for the Wisconsin Badgers. It reminds me a lot. Michigan State had a very similar stretch this season in 2024, and they failed to make a bowl game at 5-7. Like, when I look at this Badger schedule, I can't get past 8-4. Like, 8-4 is the absolute max. We take a look at those Bama game, the Michigan game, the Ohio State game, the Oregon game, and then you got your classic 50-50 games. You got Iowa in there. Like, Indiana on the road, right? Didn't even mention that one towards the end of the season. Illinois, Minnesota, Washington, like, those could all be 50-50 games for the Wisconsin Badgers. And this isn't a Wisconsin team that's going to go out and grab a lot of top talent, I don't think, in the transfer portal. We'll see. Maybe I am to be proven wrong, but I think Wisconsin's going to have to develop a lot. Maybe Luke Fickell will get a little bit of the Billy Napier treatment, where if this team does go 6-6 and they do get to a bowl game, and that's a 1-game improvement, right? Certainly Luke Fickell will be around for year number 4, but man, 5-7 or worse could possibly happen yet again for the Wisconsin Badgers within this game as well. Now, what was one gripe about the Indiana Hoosiers this year? They don't have a very tough schedule, strength of record. We know all of those things when we've talked about the Cream and Crimson this year on their way to an 11-1 season in the first season of Curt Cignetti in Bloomington, Indiana. Now, this schedule from the 2024 to 2025, it reminds me a lot of kind of how the NFL does scheduling, right? You have a team that was 5-12, maybe they weren't that good. Hey, and then they jump up, they made the playoffs, maybe they made a little bit of a run, and how the NFL does scheduling is like, hey, when you weren't good and then you jump up to good, now you play the better teams the next year. And that's kind of how the schedule shook out here for the Indiana Hoosiers in 2025. Now, of course, not including themselves, Indiana takes on 4 of the top 5 finishing teams from the conference this year. They go at Oregon, at Penn State, at Iowa, and versus Illinois. So we're really going to see what this Indiana football program is made out of. There's a lot of players that will most likely be departing this Hoosiers program this season. So we'll see how well that they can backfill certainly some of those roles this season. But they've got a decent, those road games at Iowa, at Oregon, at Penn State, right? That's not going to be certainly going to be the easiest schedule in the world. That non-conference schedule of Old Dominion, Kennesaw State, and Indiana State. Yeah, that certainly helps things out for the Hoosiers as well. Let's go back out to the Pacific Northwest. Let's talk about the Washington Huskies. Now, this is where we start to talk about a couple of quirks in the Big Ten schedule this season. When we first talk about Washington, before we get to the quirks, the Huskies don't travel out of the Evergreen State until week 6, and they have just 3 trips out to the West Coast. Of course, you got Colorado State and UC Davis, and then a bye week, and then you go out to Pullman for that Apple Cup game against Washington State. You have that Ohio State game at home. The first trip that you're going to make is Maryland. Now, Maryland, of course, that's going to be a Friday or a Saturday game, and then in about a 14-day period, you're going to take a trip out to Maryland, and then you're going to take another trip out to Michigan without a bye week, certainly in there before or after each of those games. So that's a little bit taxing. Not the greatest travel situation at that point for the Washington Huskies, but overall, I think the schedule shapes up pretty well. At Maryland, at Michigan, at Wisconsin are their 3 road trips out there during this schedule. Because hey, look towards the end of the season, you've got Washington at UCLA down in Los Angeles. When you have road trips, when you have 7 games and 5 on the road, and you go to Pullman, across the state in the Palouse, and you go down to LA, I think we can make it work, certainly, with that other scheduling quirk in the schedule for these Washington Huskies. Let's take a look at another team that has another little bit of a scheduling quirk. Let's talk about the Minnesota Golden Gophers. Minnesota is the only team in the Big Ten that is going to travel to the West Coast twice, but it's kind of to their own doing because they scheduled a non-conference series with the Cal Bears. So in week 3, they go out to Berkeley to play Cal over there. Of course, that's not a Big Ten team, so Big Ten says, hey, not our fault that you certainly did that, and you're going to go out to the West Coast 2 times. But they do have a bye after that, which certainly helps as well. Before I get into the other quirk, how about week 8 and week number 9 for the Golden Gophers? Week 8, home against Nebraska. The $5 bits of broken chair on the line. I call it the Twitter war because, man, these two fan bases online go after each other. They go after each other when they're not playing on the football field. And then they go to Iowa for the Floyd of Rosedale after that. So back-to-back big emotional rivalry games for the Minnesota Golden Gophers without a break. Now, after that Week 11 bye, you do get the time, and then you go to Autzen to play the Oregon Ducks. But this is kind of the one situation when in the Big Ten, when you're coming off of a cross-country road trip where you don't have a home game and you don't have a bye week. So after their trip to Oregon, they go to Wrigley Field to take on the Northwestern Wildcats. So certainly, and once again, when you have this much action and 18 teams and 9 conference games and you're trying to jam it all together, it's not going to be a perfect schedule. You're going to get some quirks in the schedule. Hey, Big Ten teams, just be thankful you don't get the Oregon treatment where you're playing 8 consecutive games. But that's certainly a quirk in all of this for the Minnesota Golden Gophers as well. I mentioned Rutgers. You look at them. I think that they've probably got the toughest schedule in the Big Ten to finish things off here. Home against Oregon, at Ohio State versus Penn State. They play Iowa, Minnesota, Washington, Illinois. A lot of bowl teams on that schedule for the Scarlet Knights. Look, when there's schedules here, there's a lot to break down. It can be a little bit overwhelming when you see that grid. So I'm sure I missed something. Hit me up in the comments below of things that really stood out to you as far as the schedule drop. Folks, we're going to go through a winter, some transfer portal period where it's going to be spring, then it's going to be summer. Folks, it's going to be fall of 2025 before you know it. All right, I'm Big Ten Ted. We'll see you in the next one.
Thank you for watching and listening to Big Nation. Make sure to subscribe and follow Big Ten Ted on X, YouTube, and podcast platforms to stay in the know on all things Big Ten football.